Dr. Farley, an assistant professor at the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce at the University of Kentucky. With me today is Dr. Dmitry Gorenburg, who's a research scientist at CNA, who is the editor of Problems of Post-Communism. How are you doing today, Dmitry?
I'm doing fine. Thanks for having me.
Good. Thanks for being here. So what we're going to talk about today is a host of questions associated with Russian foreign policy. And we'll get to Russian rearmament a little bit later. We'll get maybe to Russian relations with China and potentially even India a little bit later. But let's start with at least there was a flurry of conversation about this about a month ago, but I mean, it's sort of been an ongoing conversation with regards to, and it's sort of a large issue with regards to U.S.-Russian relations right now. What is the current state of relations between Russia and Syria? What are Russia's interests in Syria? And, so why, in broad terms, is Russia doing the things that it's doing or preventing the things from being done in Syria right now? What are your thoughts? I know you've written some on this, but what are your thoughts?
Yeah, sure. There's a whole range of Russian interests that converge, I guess is the right way to put it, on trying to keep Assad in power. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people I know have focused on sort of the military interests and in terms of arms sales, so that's a combination of military and economic arms sales, plus the base in Tartus, which is really not a full-fledged naval base, but more of a repair facility that doesn't really have permanent troops or ships based there.
Right. I mean, it's like a big dock or something, right? I mean, it's
back in the Soviet days, it was a repair facility, and that function kind of atrophied due to lack of use over the 90s and the last decade. And they were trying in the last, I think starting in 2007 or so, they were starting to rebuild that repair dock. And they haven't finished yet, and I'm not sure they ever will now. But in the meantime, they were using it. Once the Russian Navy started going back into the Med around that same time, around 2007, they started using it as a resupply facility and also as a kind of a port of call for R&R for the sailors. In Tartus, it's nicer there than in Severodvinsk and Murmansk and so forth. Mm-hmm. So that was the main use in recent years, but it's also the only remaining foreign facility that Russia still has. So in that sense, it is important. However, I think we should be careful not to overstate the importance of either the arms sales or the facility for overall policy. I think there are kind of bigger geopolitical concerns that are actually more involved in driving Russian policy and trying to keep Assad in place. And there are a couple of aspects here. One part is just what they see as kind of a geopolitical competition with the U.S. So there is a sense that there's this norm gradually coming into international being established in international law of responsibility to protect. Mm-hmm. And to the extent that this allows for interventions in all kinds of domestic conflicts all over the world, this is something Russia doesn't want to have any part in. Mm-hmm. And what's not just to have any part in, but to really would prefer not to be established.
Well, now, so can we pause right there? Because I'm curious, right? Because I know that the Russians mobilized the example of Kosovo back in 2008 when talking about intervention in Georgia. I mean, it seems to me that Russia could marshal responsibility to protect arguments in a variety of different ways that would make it, or sort of give the, I don't want to say the veneer of legitimacy, but that's kind of what I'm thinking. But could give some sort of currency of legitimacy in places that the Russians themselves might actually want to intervene. I mean, is there any sort of conversation about using R2P instrumentally, or is there just sort of a broader belief that this is not going to be a norm that we want to develop or a norm that we want to support?
Well, they're kind of two-sided about it. When in 2008, when Russia intervened in Georgia, there was some discussion, not in terms of response. Those terms were not used,
Mm-hmm.
but there was some discussion of the Kosovo precedent as a reason for allowing, so to speak, the intervention in Syria. But it was kind of a negative discussion in that. It was more along the lines of, if you hadn't done that, we might not have done this, rather than this is a good thing. And I think the reason why they're skittish about it, even though it might suit their purposes in some cases, is that they're still freaked out about the color revolutions.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So the balance of positive to negative is much more on the negative side for them, because they're worried that there might be some tendency towards Western intervention in not in Russia directly, but in Central Asia, maybe or in the Caucasus. So that, I think, is one of the main factors here as well in Syria, in that there is this kind of fear of the Arab Spring kind of gradually drifting closer towards the former Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
And this sort of brings me to another the regional part of the explanation, which is back when Putin first came to power, he kind of started rebuilding relations with former Soviet allies, Iraq, Syria, Libya to a lesser extent, and then also Iran, which wasn't a Soviet ally, but which had the benefit of being anti-American. So there was this kind of axis in a way, not an axis of evil, but an axis of interest, I guess, for Russia through the Middle East.
Right.
And then shortly thereafter, the United States started going through and taking out from the Russian point of view, started taking these out. First just Iraq, but then recently Libya, and now Syria. So from that point of view, and given the discussion in Israel and elsewhere, Iran could well be next. And if there's instability in Iran, that is right on former Soviet Union's borders, and could really destabilize Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, a whole range of countries there.
No.
So I think that those two factors, the sort of the global geopolitical, and then the fear of regional imbalance, plus a real belief that the people who are fighting against Assad in Syria are Islamists, and are therefore very much against certainly Russian interests, but also there are a large number of analysts in Russia who think the U.S. is profoundly misguided on this, and that they're going to, if Assad is overthrown, it'll only be worse for the U.S. down the road. Right,
and there are certainly some analysts in the United States, fewer I think, but some in the United States who feel the same way, and certainly some analysts in Israel. There's been some work about how the United States viewed Islamic extremism instrumentally during the later stages of the Cold War, not just in Afghanistan, but even sort of prior to Afghanistan, and sort of the notion that the waves of Islamic extremism threatened Soviet interests more than they threatened American interests, simply because of the large Islamic population in the United States. I mean, is there still, or in the large Islamic population in the Soviet Union? I mean, especially given the role that Saudi Arabia has played in Syria. I mean, is there some? Do the Russians simply believe the Americans are misguided, or do is there some sort of belief that there is even alliance is the wrong term, but a collusion of interests between Islamic extremists in the United States? Or, I mean, are there any thoughts at all on those issues at this point?
I haven't seen it. I haven't seen that much. I think that Russians, by and large, don't at this point don't think that the U.S. has much sympathy for Islamic radicals. They sort of take the U.S. position on that at face value. Mm-hmm. So I don't think it's this kind of any. There are plenty of conspiracy theories going around in Russia, but I don't think that's one of them. Mm-hmm. Now, as far as what the Saudis are doing, that's a different matter.
Right.
So it may be. I think there may be more of a sense that the Saudis plus the Islamists and whoever else are using the United States,
right.
who's where people don't really get what's better for them. And there's also the sense that I get, at least, that it's sort of the issues kind of died down in the press a bit. But a month or two ago, I really thought that there was at least a part of the Obama administration that is happy with Russia's intransigence. I mean, obviously they won't say it publicly. But my sense is that they really don't want to get involved in this kind of intervention. They know it could end badly. But at the same time, there's a lot of public pressure. And so it's kind of handy to have some, big global power vetoing resolutions in the UN that you can deflect outrage toward.
Right. No, I mean, I've gotten the same sense. I've gotten the same sense from some other actors. I mean, and I don't mean just sort of people within the Obama administration, but sort of people who commonly argue for interventions of this sort, that Russia is a convenient foil for sort of rendering the arguments impractical. Although, I mean, part of the conversation that came up when a month ago or so, and we'll have links to a couple of these posts, but there were a bunch of questions of why is Russia being anti-realist, and I think that we can sort of agree that no, Russia is not being anti-realist in terms of support for Syria, but is there what would Russia be willing to risk beyond what it has risked so far in support of the Assad administration? Right? Is there any appetite for any greater support, or I mean, is there going to be some sense too where they're just throwing good money after bad? It's not going to work out, and it's just time to build good relations with the successor regime?